Derek, thanks so much for joining us today. This is the start of the new season for SCOTONOMICS, so we're delighted that you're our first speaker as we head into September. And I'm sure you would agree, but I don't think we could be talking about a more important subject than we are going to discuss with you, which is the current state of the UK energy market. So thanks very much for joining us. The question I wanted to ask you was actually a question that you had on Twitter, so I hope it's okay me doing this to you. But you asked a question last week, and it was, why is the UK government, Ofgem, forcing bills up when fuel costs are zero? So would you first of all like to explain that question? Because surely costs of actual fuel are related to the costs that people are seeing on their bills. And then would you like to give us an answer?
Okay, so the way that the UK electricity market works is it's assumed that everybody is powered by the UK grid. But if you look at particularly where we are in the north of Scotland and in the Highlands and Islands, we have a huge amount of generation capacity here, and that's hydro and wind. So maybe I can turn the question round. Okay, by how much has the cost of water fallen from the sky gone up over the last year? Or by how much has the cost of wind gone up over the last year? And if I answer my own question, it hasn't gone up at all. So if it hasn't gone up at all, why are generators using those technologies able to double the price?
So the price that's being charged isn't related to the cost that the suppliers are facing. Where do they come up with that cost to pass it on into bills?
What they're doing, I think, is averaging the cost across the entire UK and assuming that every household is using a proportion of the gas. So they're saying that, whereas in the south of England, and I think in parts of Wales, generation is predominantly from gas-fired power stations. They assume that that's the case across the entire UK, even when in the local market there's no gas being used at all.
That almost seems too incredible to be true. The fact that they're not paying for something of the cost that they're passing on to individuals. Is that a decision that the UK government has made, or is it a decision that Ofgem are made, or is there any other external factor to that?
Ofgem treat this as being a UK market, and although some of the market conditions are varied, they're pretty determined to say that it's a UK market, and the same rules for charging have to apply. It's one wholesale market, one market for wholesale power across the entire UK, and if we're going to take a hit, we're all going to take a hit. Now that's a decision of the regulator. The regulator is there to look after customers. That's domestic customers and SMEs and third sector organisations who in many cases are faced with even larger increases in their bills than domestic consumers. The UK government appoints the head of Ofgem, and although it's an arm's length organisation, control of Ofgem is a Westminster government agency, and it's up to Westminster to make changes where things are going wrong.
Yeah. I think that's a really important point, because we can forget that an arm's length organisation or regulator like Ofgem is still mandated and reports to a government, in this case the UK government. The issues ostensibly stem from the Westminster government and its control of Ofgem, and it's effectively acting on its guidance. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that, yeah. If it wasn't acting on the guidance coming from the UK government, there would be changes in Ofgem. They wouldn't be allowed to continue in the way that they are. And in the way that they are, you have to assume that the UK government are happy with the action that they're taking. They're going along with it, and they could change it if they weren't happy.
So what impact is this? Are the likely price rises having in the communities that you represent in the north of Scotland?
I think this is the latest in a succession of increases, and this one and the next one, which is anticipated for late December, coming into force in January, are going to be devastating for people living in, particularly in the Highlands, where there's two elements to this. One is the cost of the electricity, but the second element, really important in rural off-grid areas, is the amount of energy you're using. So consumption is much higher in remote and rural areas where temperatures are generally lower and the lowest in the UK. So it's going to have a devastating effect. Fuel poverty, it's always been there in the background, but it's very much in the foreground now. And it's affecting people who've never had difficulty in paying their bills before. This is the first time they've seen a challenge like this in their lifetime.
You said it's been there for a while. I know there was an article back in 2018 by the ever fantastic Ferret, and they were looking at this, and they said that people in the Highlands are paying around £400 a year more for their electricity than the rest of Scotland, I think they said. So I'd imagine it's even more than the rest of the UK. So these issues have been here for a while and almost kind of bubbling under the surface. And a lot of people are saying the cost of living crisis is the same for a lot of people. There's been these issues for a while, but because it's pushing on to another level, a different group of people, and a lot more people, these concerns are really coming into the mainstream. But what do you fear for let's say the kind of the more remote rural members of your community, and also the small businesses in the Highlands?
I think the first fear is really to do with the weather. The last few years have really been pretty mild. If we end up with a really severe winter, with snow and ice, the effect that we're already seeing just intensifies and multiplies, and it's uncontrollable for individuals and for small businesses and for charities, who are all going to be faced with having to pay these extra bills, and they just won't be able to do so.
Do you believe people will be making the decision to use that phrase, kind of eat or heat?
I can't see any other outcome. That if bills remain where they are, if help isn't forthcoming, yes, those choices are very real, and ones that I really fear people in my community and across the wider area are genuinely going to be faced with this winter.
Yeah, it's really it's really sobering to think that. Okay, well, what I'd like to do now is kind of roll back and think, how did we get into this situation? Where do you want to start when we're in a situation that customers don't really have a choice on what they pay? Maybe they've got a choice of a couple of suppliers, but still comes through the same point, and we're paying so much more than a lot of people can afford, and definitely what more people would expect. When did this train leave the station? When did you think these problems were sown?
I think you have to go back to the early 80s, when the industries were privatized. There was, I think everybody thinks that what Mrs. Thatcher did was come in and sell off loss-making enterprises. She did that, but she also sold off all the profitable ones, because those were the ones that her supporters were really after. And it was the ideology was, you privatise them, their profits will go up, and all those extra profits will roll, the taxation will roll in to the Treasury, and we'll be miles better off. I think what privatised companies have managed to demonstrate beyond all else is what they became was very good at tax avoidance, and they all, their profits are rolled over, the capital gains are rolled over into new generation, and their profits have never reached the level where they're contributing more to the Treasury than the Treasury was earning when those businesses were owned. So what you have is a situation where benevolent public monopoly was replaced with private monopoly acting in its own self-interest.
Yeah, I would definitely trace it back to that point as well. And I think it's important saying that, the United Kingdom is where privatisation was taken to the extent further than any country in Europe, including and widen that to the North America and America and also Australia. Privatisation really was pushed to the extreme. And I think you would have been a little bit kind there, Derek, because I think that the message was that privatisation was to return profits to the exchequer and run it better. That was only the message. I think it was always about how to allow people who are already wealthy to earn a guaranteed income and effectively capture the commons. And nowhere in the Western world has it been done to the same extent. And I think this is what we're reaping from that being sown, years ago. And we are in these really, really difficult situation. And I know a lot of people have said, but there's a huge amount of profits being made. And of course there is. When people are forced to pay more for something that they have to pay for, there's a lot of money being made. Could you tell us where that money's going?
Yes, I think, the private enterprises have taken the extra profit and they paid it out in dividends. And they've also used it to buy back their own shares to push their value up. There's evidence that some's been reinvested in the generation business, and in particular in terms of transmission. But really, the vast majority is being paid out in dividends and in directors' bonuses. So they're the ones who've won from this process. And the public are the ones with the higher bills, and they're the ones who've lost.
Do you think it's too simple to say that this has been a clear transfer of wealth from the poorest or the average person in the UK to those who have the most money?
I think it's clear that was the intention, and the scale of these increases. The present increases is just intensifying that transfer of wealth. Poor people are being asked to pay a vast increase in their cost of energy, and those profits will boost the bottom line of every one of these privatised companies. And there's no public sector gain from that at all. It's all private individuals and businesses who are benefiting. Society as a whole is losing out. If we look specifically at what I was referring to in the tweet you mentioned at the start, when a business with no increase in costs is allowed to double its price, all of that is profit. All of that appears on the bottom line. All of that has been taken from individuals and families and small businesses and charities and paid over to individual companies and their shareholders.
One thing I wanted to also get your review on was the role of government in redistributing the benefits from any particular situation. And again, I think the UK, and I would say Westminster in particular, is an outlier in that, Liz Truss has said recently that she's not in favour of handouts. And she believes that when the government steps into a market and starts to redistribute the benefits, that's a handout rather than the fundamental role of a government, which is to make sure that to some extent the benefits of any particular situation are spread across the society. Would you agree with the UK's position and understanding of that, and vis-a-vis other Western European countries?
I think this is really the key. It's whether the market is in actual fact being regulated at all. I think the danger is that, we have a regulator in place, but increases of this magnitude in price make it appear, to all intents and purposes, to be an unregulated market, one that looks very like a monopoly or an oligopoly, where a small number of very large firms control the market. They're making much higher profit than they should be if this was a competitive market. But the regulator, rather than stepping in and looking at generation and saying, look, you're making too much, guys, we're going to dampen your profit margins down, they're actually intervening in the market, not in the interest of the customer, but in the interest of the generators to shove prices up. And that seems, there's a term in economics, regulatory capture. I think if you were trying to come up with a textbook example of it, this is not a bad way of going.
I do think this will be a case study of when regulation has proved to be toothless, because a lot of commentators talk about the poor regulation in countries in Africa and South America and Eastern Europe, and actually Ofgem is a regulator, but it has absolutely no teeth. And I think, as you said, I think it's an easy argument to make that actually it's working on the benefit of the producers rather than the consumers. Your part of Scotland creates so much renewable energy. Can you explain why that isn't having any impact or any positive impact in the prices that people throughout Scotland are paying? Because that's certainly an area you see most people concerned with. We are generating all of this electricity. Why are we not seeing cheaper prices? Does it just go back to this point about how things are priced, or do you think there's more of a fundamental issue than that?
It's a much more fundamental issue than that. It's also about access to markets. There's a lot of community energy produced in Scotland, in the Highlands and Islands, and more generally now. Community Energy Scotland, I think, is a global exemplar of what can be done to help communities to help themselves. So they're excellent at that. Where the problem comes is when they try and hook their production up to the grid, because access to the grid is based on incumbency. If you come along and say, look, I'm a community generator and I can produce electricity for 5 pence a kilowatt hour, and I'm having to pay under the new regime 50 pence a kilowatt hour. If you can produce power for 5 pence a kilowatt hour and the incumbents are selling it to you at 50 pence, in a competitive market, you should be able to get your power onto the grid. But it isn't a market that works like that. Once you have access to the grid, you've been confirmed as having access to the grid. That access continues until the time runs out. So it's 25 years. There's no break clauses. And you can put your price up. Once you've got access, you can put your price up as much as you like. And it doesn't matter that somebody else comes along and is willing to supply consumers at a much lower price. They're not allowed onto the grid. Now, that's a strange way to run a railroad.
Yeah, well, that's incredible. From an economic perspective, in a competitive market, a market is designed so that the person who is providing the product for the least price is able to enter a market to gain those customers. But you're saying that they're not able to do that because people are in those positions already. Well, that's incredible.
Not in this market. Ofgem are the regulator. They set the rules that are incredibly complex rules that are very difficult to understand and have become, over the passage of time, the only people who understand the rules are the regulators and the regulated. So the big six energy firms employ lots of people who can understand the rules and who can influence how those rules are changed over time. So that there are lots of consultations undertaken, but the weight that's given to submissions from incumbents, I think, is much higher than the people trying to break into the market and trying to adjust the market to operate in a more competitive way.
Another obvious question, considering the climate crisis that we're in, I take it if you're generating electricity from a purely renewable source like wind, then that's prioritised over electricity that's being generated by gas.
I don't think that is really where we are. I think
because that's where we should be, isn't it? That's where we should be. If we're serious about that.
Yes, that's right. And if you're coming along with new wind, that should have access to the grid. But reality, looking at the numbers, we didn't replace. Coal disappeared very quickly, which is good from an environmental point of view, but it wasn't replaced, as I think people had hoped, with renewable power. Whether that's wind or solar or hydro or pumped storage hydro or tidal, there has been an increase in wind power, but that's really the only one. And at the same time, nuclear power was drifting down. So nuclear power stations are reaching the end of their life. They're not producing as much power as they did. And that's a problem, I think, particularly in France as well. We used to get a lot of spare power coming over on the interconnector from France. The system's reversed at the moment. And at the height of this crisis in pricing, we're selling electricity to France, which must mean that more expensive plant is coming online in the UK to meet demand here. So I'm not certain how that part of the market could be working in consumers' interests either.
Yeah. No, it's as you said, they're very complicated rules that take a lot of time and effort to properly understand. And that leads us nicely on to a kind of short discussion around the levers that the Scottish Government has. So we're going to kind of break this down. The first one is the levers particularly around the energy market. And then the second one is the levers, the kind of greater levers around the cost of living crisis. Would you like to just kind of finish on your thoughts on the levers that we have to improve the energy situation in Scotland?
I think this is actually the clearest example of where Scotland is lacking the levers. We have no say over what Ofgem does in Scotland. We're not able to influence the policies they adopt here. We're not able to, I think, as you discussed, make sure that community generation has priority and can get on. We're not able to influence whether low-cost generation can displace much more expensive power that's already on the grid. There's no break clause, so that after 5 years, if an organisation has doubled their price or trebled their price or quadrupled their price, that they can be kicked off in favour of much lower cost generation. Those things really matter, and at present, with the existing settlement, we have no say over those policy areas at all, and the Scottish Parliament is pretty much powerless. They can write to Ofgem. Occasionally, they can meet with them. I've had meetings with Ofgem, but there is a real democratic deficit in terms of energy in Scotland. We're a bit part player in terms of regulation, but we're a massive player in terms of generation. So that deficit has to be addressed.
And that's part of the reserved and devolved powers. Now, moving on to the cost of living crisis, what more do you think the Scottish Government, but also local councils, can be doing to support people over the coming months?
I think really you're targeting that question in the wrong place. You've just identified that the most important thing is where control lies in these markets. Control lies at Westminster. The solutions lie at Westminster too, because they need massive amounts of spend, and that's going to have to come either from the centre or from borrowing. The Scottish Government has no ability to borrow. So only Westminster can solve these problems. The council can do what it can to assist, but really, we can support individuals. We can look at what we can do in terms of providing a safe refuge for people, maybe somewhere that's warm in each community, that people not able to pay their bills can go to, so they're not sitting in the cold every day. But in terms of paying for this, really, it's a Westminster problem, and it'll have to be a Westminster financed solution. If you give us the money, I'm sure the Scottish Government will set up a scheme to assist, and I'm absolutely certain that councils would help the people in their area if funding comes, maybe from a VAT rebate or something like that. That could come if it isn't being paid directly to individuals. Then it could certainly come to councils, and we have teams who make sure that we have one of the best teams in the UK. They make sure that all of our vulnerable adults and are making the claims that they need to make to get the benefits that they're entitled to and that they're going to desperately need. We're starting off from a very good place. We have an excellent team. And I think councils across Scotland have those teams in place. They work with the CAB, with the Citizens Advice Bureau, who also, I'm certain, if they're given the support, could do a fantastic job of looking after people over the winter. But they have to get the funding, and the funding has to come from Westminster.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that the funding has to come from Westminster, because Westminster is the currency issuer, and it's Westminster that pushes the currency into the money supply. It's not Holyrood. So, you know, if we want more funding, it really does have to come from Westminster. Is there anything more you think the Scottish Government could have done to now? And I'm thinking kind of in two areas really around the cost of living crisis, and a faster transformation towards low fossil fuel use in transport, and also an increased insulation of homes, because those are two areas that Scotland is devolved, and there's certainly two areas where a lot of people don't think we've moved quite quickly. Do you think there's any kind of culpability there over the last few years that maybe we should have been moving more to low fossil fuel transport and also insulating our buildings better? Yes,
I think there is more they could have done. I think they could have won the referendum in 2014. Certainly, if they win the next one, then these are issues that would be very high priorities and really need to be tackled.
Yeah. Well, I certainly think there are areas that we know we should be doing a lot more on as well.
I think there is a standard of housing that is really challenging in terms of trying to keep them warm. Our homes are not well insulated, and they do leak heat. Yes, if we had control over this, certainly that's an area where I think we really could make an impact and help reduce people's bills. There's lots of things that we could be doing. I think if you look into the future, solar panels are an awful lot cheaper at producing power than it's being supplied by grid operators. If you can link that in with a water tank that's able to store the heat better, then that works too. If you had battery storage, so that when your solar panels were producing power and you weren't using it, it could store the power for you, that would be good. There are a whole range of things that we could do, but we need the powers to do them. And the sooner we have those powers, the better for all concerned.
Is drilling more oil and gas, is this not the answer to all of the problems we've been discussing?
Is this not? We've two issues here. In the short run, I can't predict how long Vladimir Putin's going to continue with the madness in Ukraine. I hope he goes home tomorrow, but I doubt that's likely to happen. So we could be in for a prolonged spell where markets are destabilized, and gas prices are very high. Gas prices are very high, so the way to deal with that is to tackle the switch from fossil fuels, which are expensive, to alternatives which are not. I think it's accelerating the drive away from fossil fuels I think the crisis has shown, if we were using solar, if we were using tidal, if we had more hydro power, then we wouldn't be facing the bills that we are facing. So those technologies have to be the future, and the faster we get after them, the better. And I know that I've dodged your question slightly, but I think we have to take a long-term view on this. I think we have to focus on renewables, and I think we have to get there much faster than we have been getting there over the last few years.
I would completely agree. I think with oil and gas drilling, there isn't really a short term. It is a medium term to have all these extra resources, certainly any new oil fields and gas fields online. And obviously, there's a huge issue with the emissions from fossil fuels that we can't walk away from in terms of the climate crisis. So my last question, hopefully in a little bit more of an upbeat mood. If Scotland was independent, what would a Scottish energy market look like, and how would it be different from what we have at the moment?
I think there would be a lot more renewable power in there, and I think a lot more of it would be community owned, one way or another.
And do you think we would have nationalised utilities in energy in Scotland?
I think the privatisation undertaken by the UK has been a disaster, and it's more of a disaster every day. And I wouldn't want to see that continue, whether it was through nationalisation or simply by the process of replacing the existing power producers with home-owned energy that was a tenth of the price. The sooner that happens, the sooner that we get after the goal of affordable energy for everybody in Scotland, the happier I'll be.
And I think too often we can have this discussion between privatisation and nationalisation, and I think there's a huge area in between. And I think powerful communities and regions who are controlling and pricing their electricity. And I also think that if you're looking at energy as a system, in terms of system dynamics, you need much more resilience and you need much more variety. And I think one of the huge issues with privatisation is doing one thing one way. And I think we can see if it's done incorrectly, then it causes huge problems for everyone in the country. Derek, thank you so much for spending the time. I know you've had an incredibly busy day and a busy week, and I'm sure you're going to have a much more challenging few months ahead. So thank you very much for your time, and hopefully we can speak to you in slightly better terms, maybe next year after winter.
I hope it's a very mild winter, and I look forward to speaking with you again. Thanks.
Thank you very much.